He had loved the king, or maybe he thought he had. All we know is that love is a strange, unpredictable thing. It can bloom in the most unlikely places and survive even the harshest winters. But sometimes, and especially when exposed to the harsh light of power, it can be punished in ways no human should ever endure. This is a tale of such punishment, of a love story gone terribly wrong. But before we begin, remember this. This isn't just a tale of betrayal or war or kingship. It's a story of love turned into a weapon. And desire, when exposed to the harsh light of power, could be punished in ways no human should ever endure. If you're drawn to the buried truths and unspoken horrors of history, subscribe to the channel. Here, we don't rewrite history, we bury it. Let us begin. His name was Hugh Despenser the Younger, a nobleman, yes, but more than that, a man whose fate was tied to a king's heart, and ultimately to a nation's rage. The year was 1322. England groaned under the weight of civil unrest as people starved. Its barons rebelled, but in the royal court, one man thrived, Hugh. He wasn't a war hero. He wasn't beloved by the people. What he had was access to the crown, to the throne, to Edward II himself. It began as loyalty, service, friendship, but soon it twisted into something more. The king, still grieving the loss of his first companion, Piers Gaveston, found in Hugh something familiar. Charm, intelligence, a kind of elegance that clashed with the brutality of medieval politics. Hugh, he played the part, whispered counsel in Edward's ear, stoked the flames of isolation, and in time became the king's favorite. But in this world, favorite meant something more. Not just affection, not just proximity. It meant power unearned, unchecked, and dangerously absolute. Hugh began seizing lands from the nobility, not through war, but through law, twisting royal decrees to claim what wasn't his. He ruined families, imprisoned rivals, silenced opposition, all with Edward's blessing. The court changed. Where once sat proud lords and wise advisors, now stood men too afraid to speak. Because Hugh's gaze was everywhere, and Edward's favor meant immunity. But there was one person who saw through the facade, one person who refused to play the game. Edward's own wife, Queen Isabella, daughter of France, unyielding, observant, cold as frost when crossed. At first, she played along. She endured the humiliation, watched as her husband gave Hugh everything, titles, lands, even military command. She waited, listened, learned, and when the moment was right, she struck. In 1325, Isabella left for France under the pretext of diplomacy. But she had no intention of returning alone. In Paris, she found Roger Mortimer, an exiled baron with hatred burning behind his eyes. Together, they planned the unmaking of a king, not just Edward, but Hugh as well. Because everyone knew Edward without Hugh was vulnerable. But Hugh without Edward was nothing. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a modest force. To their surprise, they were greeted not with resistance, but with cheers. Nobles joined them, peasants supported them. Even priests prayed for their success. Edward and Hugh were forced to flee, disguised, panicked, dragged from one hiding place to the next. But England was no longer theirs, and the net was closing. They were captured in South Wales, dragged through streets, mocked, beaten, no longer king and favored, just traitors in robes. Hugh was put on trial, if it could even be called that. No jury, no defense, only accusations, read aloud as crowds howled for justice. He was charged with theft, treason, and forbidden acts. The last charge was whispered, but everyone knew what it implied. They weren't just punishing a political manipulator. They were punishing a relationship. A man who had grown too close to the king. The verdict was predetermined. The sentence, worse than death. Because for Hugh Despenser the younger, they didn't just want to kill him, they wanted to erase him, okay? And so they prepared a spectacle that would echo through centuries. Music halts, silence. Then slowly, the dull rhythm of a heartbeat resumes. It wouldn't happen in secret. It would be public, a lesson for all. A warning carved not into flesh, but into memory. He was paraded through the streets of Hereford, humiliated before the people, mocked, cursed, despised. The punishment was brutal, so severe that even chroniclers, hardened by medieval cruelty, wrote of it with horror. Not only his body was destroyed, but his legacy, his name, his memory. His remains were scattered, displayed as warnings across England, his head raised high in London. A man who had once ruled the court, reduced to fragments, ash and whispers. Soundscapes fade to cold wind. A church bell tolls once. Then silence. Now, if you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who values deeper knowledge and a good story. That's why you should subscribe. Every week, we release new videos that dive deep into topics that most people just gloss over. From uncovering the hidden reasons behind major historical events to bringing you stories of fascinating individuals. We keep things engaging and informative. Think of it as your cheat code to sounding smart in any conversation. So click that subscribe button. You won't regret it. The silence after his death was louder than the crowd that had roared for his mutilation. His body had been carved into a lesson, scattered across England like a warning written in blood. And yet, something lingered. Not guilt, not grief, but a cold, calculated satisfaction from those who had orchestrated his fall. Queen Isabella, once humiliated by the sight of her husband's favorite parading power before her very throne, now stood triumphant. Roger Mortimer, the exiled baron turned kingmaker, had demonstrated exactly what happens to those who dare love a king too boldly, too openly, too dangerously. But Hugh's destruction wasn't just personal revenge, it was political theater designed to crush dissent and reshape the narrative of Edward's reign into a cautionary tale. They didn't just end Hugh Despenser's life, they burned his name into the soil as a symbol of royal corruption, of unnatural affection, of power gained through passion rather than bloodline or war. And Edward, the once proud king who had showered Hugh with titles, lands, and unchecked influence, he was no longer a monarch. He was a shadow, a prisoner, a man made hollow by the violent removal of the one person who had truly mattered to him. Dragged from castle to castle, Edward was a king in name only. His commands were ignored. His supporters were scattered. His crown, heavy with disgrace, had become a relic, something others wielded in his name while he sat in chains, staring at cold stone walls. Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents, speaking for his young son, Edward III, who had been crowned while his father still breathed. But everyone knew who held the true power. And yet that power was fragile because secrets have weight and rumors, especially those soaked in blood, never stay buried for long. The people remembered the spectacle. They remembered the execution. They remembered the screams. But they also remembered what led to it, the favoritism, the sudden rise of a man they never elected. The quiet intimacy between king and companion that had shifted the axis of royal politics. And as weeks turned to months, a question began to whisper through the court, through the taverns, through the cloisters of the monasteries. Was Edward truly gone? Or had the queen merely taken everything from him except his heartbeat? Official records claimed he died a prisoner, quietly in the depths of Berkeley Castle. But the story that spread darker, crueler, soaked in whispered horror told of a death far more graphic. The tale that survives isn't one of poison or quiet strangulation. No, it's of a method reserved not for kings, but for traitors, for abominations, for those who needed to be unmade from the inside out. A red-hot poker forced into his body while he was still breathing. A death that left no external wounds, no scars to show the crime. A message hidden in torture. Love the wrong man, and you will burn for it. Whether it was true or not no longer mattered, because the story was believed. And belief in the medieval world was more powerful than truth. It shaped memory. It guided fear. It dictated how future kings would behave, how close they could let others stand beside their throne. And it created a boundary between affection and destruction, between loyalty and death. And at its center, forever embedded in the black heart of English history, was Hugh Despenser, the favorite, the lover, the man whose rise rewrote the rules and whose fall rewrote them again in flame and ash. But what did it mean to be a favorite in those times? It meant power, yes, but it also meant exposure. It meant your life was tied not to your blood, but to the whims of one man. And that man, however regal, however devoted, could not protect you when the world turned against you. Edward's affection had given Hugh the world, but it had also painted a target across his back. And when the blades came for him, they did not just aim to kill. They aimed to punish, to humiliate, to reduce him to something less than human. His execution was not just about removing a threat. It was about purging a presence, making an example, cleansing the court of the man who had, for a brief time, made the king human. And that, perhaps, was his real crime. Not treason, not theft, but that he made Edward feel. That he stood beside the king, not as a servant, not as a soldier, but as a companion. That he saw the man beneath the crown and loved him for it. That kind of intimacy, in a time of cold strategy and arranged unions, was dangerous. It could inspire loyalty that bypassed the church, the law, even the crown itself. It threatened the order, the chain of power. And when power feels threatened, it responds not with words, but with fire. Edward's silence after Hugh's death was telling. He made no speeches. He gave no resistance. He simply faded, as if the light inside him had been extinguished the moment Hugh's was. The two were linked in history, in politics, in Levant, finally, in destruction. One torn apart by mobs. The other left to rot in isolation. Both transformed into myths, cautionary tales that echoed in the halls of future kings who learned from their downfall, not what love meant, but what it cost. This was the legacy left behind, a nation that had watched a man be unmade in public and another erased in private. And in between them, a silence so thick it still stretches across the centuries. Not a silence of peace, but of warning. Edward may have won the crown, but it was Hugh's blood that stained it, and that stain never washed away. And now, for our final story tonight, about a love that burned but never faded. Hugh Despenser had been more than a lover to King Edward II of England. He was a counselor, a confidant, a partner in both power and pleasure. But when the king's wife, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, seized the throne, Hugh became a problem. He represented the old regime. It's worse, he embodied the king's weakness. And in medieval England, there was only one punishment for that death. The details are gruesome. Hugh was stripped naked, suspended by chains, and castrated. Then he was disemboweled while still alive. Finally, he was burned at the stake. The entire spectacle designed to humiliate, to break the king, to send a message to the entire court. Don't get close to the king. Don't influence the king. Don't dare to love the king. The death of Hugh Despenser had not only broken Edward, had exposed a new truth about England's monarchy. Affection was dangerous, and love, directed in the wrong place, was a crime punishable by fire, steel, and spectacle. The public had cheered as Hugh was torn apart. Yet what lingered wasn't celebration, it was unease. They had seen a man dismembered for love, for proximity, for favor. And deep inside they knew that what happened to him could happen again to anyone who stood too close to power. As winter fell over England, the throne no longer shimmered with gold. It pulsed with fear. Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer had claimed the reins, guiding the kingdom through their young son's name. But the shadow of their cruelty grew heavier by the day. They had destroyed the king's favorite, silenced the king himself, and ruled with cold precision. But even those who held the blade are not immune to its edge. Edward II, imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, had become a ghost. His days were filled with damp stone, rotting straw, and the echoes of footsteps he couldn't trust. His meals were sparse, his guards silent. And the worst part was the silence in his own mind, because without Hugh, he was not a ruler. He was not a man. He was something waiting to be forgotten. Rumors swirled that he spoke to shadows, that he stared at the fire for hours, unmoving, seeing in the flames not warmth but memory, the memory of a face twisted in agony, of a scream buried in the roar of a crowd, of hands that once held his own, now burned to ash, and then he too disappeared. The official story claimed illness, a fever, natural causes. But no one believed that, not after what had been done to Despenser. The alternate story, the one that slipped between the stones of monasteries and the parchment of whispered letters, was far more grotesque. It claimed Edward was killed quietly, yes, but not mercifully, that a red-hot poker had been used to penetrate him from behind, scorching his insides while leaving no visible wound. The same punishment inflicted upon his lover now applied to the king himself, as if to make them one in death as they had been in life. There were no witnesses, no trial, just the legend of a fire and a scream that never stopped echoing inside the walls of that castle. But even that horror couldn't contain the rot within the new regime. Isabella and Mortimer ruled with increasing paranoia. Every whisper felt like a dagger, every courtier's glance a possible betrayal. They had removed Edward and Despenser, but they could not remove the memory of what they had done. Guilt, after all, is its own kind of poison, and it seeped into the cracks of the court, into the corridors of castles, into the mind of a boy, Edward III, who watched, listened, and waited. At just 17, he had seen his father imprisoned, his mother transformed into a tyrant, and his kingdom turned into something cold and unnatural. And then he struck. In 1330, in a swift, calculated coup, Edward III seized control. Timur was arrested and sentenced to death. Not in secret, not quietly, but publicly hanged at Tyburn as crowds gathered to witness the fall of the man who had ruled from the shadows. There was no torture, no spectacle, just a rope and gravity. Caps, even Edward III knew the line between justice and vengeance had already been crossed too many times. As for Isabella, she was spared execution but exiled from power. She lived the rest of her life in quiet seclusion, wrapped in wealth, but never again in control. Some say she wandered her estate at night, talking to ghosts. Others claimed she had gone mad, but one thing was certain: she never ruled again. And she never spoke of Hugh Despenser. Not once, as if by not naming him, she could erase what had been done. But history has a long memory. The death of Hugh Despenser and the horror inflicted on Edward II became more than royal tragedy. It became a legend, a lesson, a scar. The English monarchy would never again allow such intimacy between king and favorite to rise unchecked. Future monarchs kept their affections buried deep beneath protocol and ceremony. And still, the story of Despenser survived, passed in hushed tones through generations of historians, playwrights, and chroniclers, not because they pitied him, but because what was done to him revealed the brutal mechanics of power, how it seduces, exposes, and then destroys. In the centuries that followed, Despenser's name appeared in plays, in sermons, in the margins of history books, always connected to one emotion: fear. Not fear of him, but fear of becoming him, of being too close to the throne, of being loved too much by someone the world demanded be untouchable. His death wasn't just a political act, it was a myth-making ritual, one designed to show that in the eyes of empire, Love was weakness, and weakness was unforgivable. But perhaps the greatest tragedy wasn't the castration or the public disembowelment or even the burning. It was the knowledge that the man who held the king's heart was reduced to a symbol, to an example, to a warning etched in fire. He had once been a noble, a counselor, a partner, and in the end he became a legend soaked in blood. A reminder that in royal courts, affection is not protection, it is peril. And now, centuries later, we still speak his name, Hugh Despenser. Not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a man who dared to be seen and paid the price with his body. The death of Hugh Despenser, while horrific, was a brutal reality of the politics of the 14th century. Such violence was not uncommon during that era. However, what sets Despenser's demise apart is the lingering impact it had on the psyche of medieval England. His story didn't end with his execution. Instead, it seeped into the very fabric of English society, becoming a cautionary tale that echoed through the corridors of power and the chambers of the heart. You see, in the aftermath of Despenser's execution, there was a conscious effort to distance Edward III from any association with his disgraced favorite. Chronicles were rewritten, memories were suppressed, and the official narrative portrayed Despenser as nothing more than a treacherous villain. But this sanitized version of events couldn't completely erase the truth. Like a phantom limb, the memory of Despenser remained, haunting the dreams of the nobility and the clergy alike. In the years following the execution, whispers replaced open displays of affection in the court of Edward III. Advisors kept their distance. Nobles distanced themselves from the king, and the warmth of camaraderie turned into a chilling formality. The king's inner circle became a place of shadows, where smiles were strained and secrets were buried deep. Edward III, once known for his charm and charisma, retreated into a shell, his joy replaced by a haunting melancholy. The exuberance of his youth gave way to the chill weight of responsibility, a burden he now bore alone. And then there were the clergy, those who had condemned and profited from Despenser's demise. They, too, were affected by the haunting. Sermons that once denounced Hugh now carried undertones of regret. His prayers for the king took on a somber tone, acknowledging a wound that refused to heal. Monasteries that had celebrated the downfall of the favorite became strangely silent, the monks haunted by the realization that they, too, had played a part in a tragedy that now cast a long shadow over the kingdom. Even the chronicles, eager to absolve Edward III of any blame, couldn't completely erase the image of Despenser. In their retellings, Despenser's crimes were magnified, his character demonized, and his relationship with the king reduced to mere manipulation. Yet, these very chronicles inadvertently highlighted the depth of their master's fondness for his favorite by emphasizing how threatened the monarchy was by that bond. And so it was that Despenser's spirit, though brutally severed from his body, continued to permeate the consciousness of medieval England. He became a specter that stalked the halls of power, a specter that whispered in the ears of the nobility, reminding them of the cost of intimacy in a world that demanded only steel. He became a specter that haunted the clergy, driving them to atone for their complicity in his death through somber prayers and acts of penance. And he became a specter that chilled the very heart of the kingdom, turning the once vibrant court of Edward III into a place of hushed tones and veiled glances. The irony was that in attempting to purge the memory of Hugh Despenser, the monarchy inadvertently enshrined him in the collective unconscious of medieval England. Despenser, the man who had climbed too high, loved too deeply, and died too violently, became a symbol of the human cost of unchecked ambition, of the danger of intimacy in a world of power, and of the enduring strength of love in the face of hate. And so his story endured, not in monuments or paintings, but in the subtle tremors that ran through medieval England whenever a king smiled too warmly or a courtier whispered a secret in the royal ear, 4 in the court of Edward III, and in the courts that followed. There was always the memory of Hugh, the man who dared to love a king. In the heart of 14th century England, amidst a time when kings were not born to rule and counselors held more power than God, there lived a man named Hugh Despenser. His story is not just one of death. It's a story of punishment designed to make affection look monstrous, to transform tenderness into treason, to take a man who was once a heartbeat away from a crown and reduce him to a cautionary tale whispered through time. And what endures centuries later is not just the memory of torture or the grotesque spectacle of a man's body carved up in public. It's the realization that this happened not because of war, not because of crime, but because of closeness. Because one man loved a king too much, because a king could not bear to let him go. The world responded with blades and fire. What happened to Hugh Despenser wasn't just a moment of medieval cruelty. It was a cultural decision to make an example out of intimacy, and that decision never truly went away. When we speak his name today, we don't do so to honor his life. We do it to confront what was done to him, to recognize that power often destroys what it cannot control. That history, when stripped of its gold and banners, is soaked in blood and built on the backs of those who got too close to the fire. Now, before we dive into the depths of this harrowing tale, a word of caution. Some stories, like ancient wounds, reopen easily. This is one such tale. This is the story of a bond that was considered a sin, a love that was deemed an offense, and a death that was nothing short of a spectacle. A spectacle, not because it was grand, but because it was grotesque. This is the story of Hugh Despenser, the man who loved a king too much. Hugh Despenser rose to prominence during the reign of Edward II, a king infamous not for conquests, but for choices. Choices that led to a kingdom divided and a dynasty disputed. Amidst the machinations of Queen Isabella and the rise of Roger Mortimer, Despenser found himself at the epicenter of a power struggle. Accused of conspiring against the crown, he was arrested, tortured, and finally executed in a manner designed not just to end his life, but to sever his very essence. On November 25, 1326, in the town of Hereford, England, Hugh Despenser the Younger was born. Born into a family with aspirations, he received a prestigious education at the renowned University of Oxford. His early life was a blend of privilege and ambition, setting the stage for a rise that few could predict. Despenser's trajectory shifted dramatically when he entered the royal court of King Edward II. Initially appointed as a clerk, his role quickly evolved into a position of great influence. He became the king's personal secretary, privy councillor, and a trusted advisor. This proximity to power, however, did not come without envy. His influence over the young king saw many rivals grow wary, including the formidable Queen Isabella. As the years progressed, Despenser's star continued to rise, culminating in his elevation to the peerage as Baron Despenser of Elmley. However, this elevation only intensified the animosity towards him, leading to accusations of favoritism and disloyalty. Despite these challenges, Despenser's commitment to the crown remained steadfast. During the turbulent events of 1321, when King Edward was briefly deposed, Despenser stood by him, showcasing loyalty that knew no bounds. The turning point came when the king, deeply in debt, entrusted Despenser with managing his finances. While successful, this only fueled the flames of resentment, leading the barons to accuse Despenser of exploiting the king's trust for personal gain. Tensions escalated, culminating in the infamous Mercat Cross incident, where Despenser was attacked. Fearing for his life, he fled to London, marking the beginning of the end, with Queen Isabella and her son, the future King Edward III. Rallying support against him, Despenser's position became increasingly precarious. He found solace only in the unwavering support of King Edward II. On September 29, 1326, both men were captured, marking the tragic climax of their story. Despenser's imprisonment was a prelude to a fate worse than death. He was subjected to public humiliation and torture. His body mutilated as a spectacle, sending shockwaves that echoed through the ages. The king's attempt to shield him only solidified his own demise. For Edward II, the sight of Despenser being dragged through the streets, his body torn apart piece by piece, was too much to bear. He died soon after, leaving behind a legacy marred not just by controversy, but also by a profound sense of loss. Thank you for listening. And if you crave more historical tales of love, loss, and legacy, don't forget to follow for more stories. Till next time, remember, history is not just about dates and battles. It's about the echoes of lives lived, loves lost, and lessons left behind.